Okay, I think we can get started. If more come, that's more the merrier. That's awesome. Thank you all for making time to be here today. My name is Jeff Kubiak. I'm a professor of practice here at ASU, where I serve as the director of future security education in ASU's Future Security Initiative. The educational offerings I help guide include MA in Global Security, the MAGS, which is a non-technical concentration in cybersecurity, and as well as it has the first of its kind concentration in irregular warfare. We also offer a graduate certificate in global security and competitive statecraft. Today's event is one in a series of events that we host each fall and spring semesters to highlight the thought-leading security practitioner faculty that teach in our programs. Today, I'm fortunate enough to be hosting my friend and colleague, Candace Rondeaux. Candace has a distinguished leadership, journalism, and research career. In addition to being a professor of practice with this Future Security Initiative, teaching courses in the MAGS on proxy warfare and open source intelligence, she currently serves as the Senior Director of Future Frontlines program and the Planetary Politics program at New America, where she leads interesting and cutting-edge research on things like you hear about today, including Russian hybrid warfare. Her past work has included being a strategic advisor for the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction and senior program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she launched the Resolve Network, a global research consortium on violent extremism. An expert an expert on security sector reform, governance, and electoral politics in conflict settings. She spent 5 years living and working in South Asia, where she served as a South Asia bureau chief for the Washington Post and a senior analyst on Afghanistan for the International Crisis Group. She holds a BA in Russian Area Studies from Sarah Lawrence College, an MA in Journalism from NYU, and a master's in Public Policy from Princeton. She has a new book coming out next month that I'm hoping she'll discuss today, titled Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos. Candace and I are going to have a conversation real quick on a couple of topics, but at any point in time, if you've got questions, please use the question and answer block, and I will help facilitate the question and answers through that. But initially, we're just going to start with a chat, Candace, on kind of where you've been and what you've been doing. I know you've titled today's talk NATO's New Anchor. I heard you've been traveling in Europe. I was wondering if you'd share with us some of the things you've come away from that visit with.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to get an opportunity to chat with you, catch up on things. And I also enjoy getting the questions in the webinar from the MAGS community. So I'm really pleased to be here again, especially since I am about to go on the road yet again, doing some research travel and some travel in connection with my book, forthcoming on May 13th, Putin's Sledgehammer. So lots to do, lots to talk about. Yeah, I mean, as you noted, I just got back about 10 days ago from a pretty lengthy, extensive trip to Europe. The purpose was kind of twofold. One was to kind of check in with interlocutors in, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense in various countries, among our transatlantic allies, specifically in France, the United Kingdom, and Poland. And the other is, I'm continuing to do my research on this evolving irregular warfare campaign that Russia is starting to propagate in mostly the Baltic states, although not exclusively. It's actually across Europe. And I guess we'll talk a little bit about that. So, and also interestingly, I was invited along with my colleague Ben Dalton, who's my co-researcher on a lot of the work, to kind of look into and talk about and debate the aspects of digital currency and organized crime and mercenary activity. And this was an Interpol conference that was super interesting. So a lot of converging kind of paths here. It
Yeah.
just happens that the week that we took off for Europe, a lot of things were happening, of course, in the headlines. I live here in Washington on Capitol Hill. And just as I was leaving, there was new announcements about potential tariffs that the White House was planning to impose on a variety of actors, including, of course, European partners. There was, of course, the tension over the United States, negotiations or brokering of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. That was going on. And then, of course, famously, Signalgate and the whole signal exchange between Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Vice President J.D. Vance and others, which really exposed a lot of, interesting kind of insights into how some people in the Trump administration think about Europe and think about the transatlantic alliance. There was, of course, a lot of commentary that was quite negative, in that chat, even though it was supposed to be
Hmm.
the whole world now knows sort of the contents of it. So all of that was sort of happening when I set out for Europe that week. And um, what was interesting, one of the reasons I think we wanted to talk about this in the framework of the new NATO anchor, right, is there is a shift going on.
Hmm.
The United States under the Trump administration is making a pronounced decision, a very profound decision to reorient the U.S. positioning within the NATO alliance. Now, there are, I think, a lot of different variants. I think there's a lot of confusion about exactly what that means because, at any given time, we're getting different messages from different parts of the White House and the administration. On the one hand, it seemed to mean a couple months ago, a kind of pure break with U.S. support for Ukraine. And it was sort of not much more evolved than that.
Hmm.
And progressively, as that sort of relationship began to show, of course, on television with the confrontation between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump, as that started to kind of evolve, both in the news headlines but also in the background, there was this question of sort of beginning negotiations between the United States and Russia on a completely bilateral front, which
Yeah.
of course immediately threw, I think, the transatlantic alliance into a kind of almost upheaval, right? I mean, I think we saw the reaction from Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, which was very strong and stern. And at the same time, we saw, Keir Starmer, who's of course the PM of the United Kingdom, trying to kind of find a balance. In the meantime, in the background, all of this was happening, and there were headlines happening in Germany, which of course is by far the wealthiest player on the chessboard when it comes to NATO transatlantic alliances in Europe itself.
Hmm.
And that very same week that all of this was unfolding, and in fact, as I was traveling, Germany voted for the first time in its history since the end of World War II to eliminate the debt ceiling for expenditures on defense
Hmm.
and make this change in its constitution. So huge, I mean, just historic events happening.
Yeah.
Uh, and it was really obvious that the upheaval was causing a lot of introspection, but also kind of determination and fear. I would say if I was going to go around the horn and very,
Hmm.
um, the United Kingdom, I sort of had the sense that there was shock and disbelief, but still strong faith in the durability of the so-called special relationship. If in the context of less faith, less confidence that the United States would remain inside the alliance or would remain to its commitment on, uh,
Yeah.
countering Russia. And France was kind of the same, but the place that was super interesting, and I think we can talk about this more, was Poland, which of
Yeah.
course, shares a border with Russia via Kaliningrad, has this enormously like, freighted history with Russia, dating back to the early 1400s, really. And, there, I think there was this sort of shock and disorientation. And yet Poland is one of the bigger, spenders when it comes to defense GDP
Sure.
ratio. In fact, it's like leading. And all the other Baltic states are. So what I felt there was that like there's a new center of gravity inside the alliance, that's a new anchor, and it seems to be shifting more and more to the east.
But it seems like they would have the awareness of it, right? Because they share borders with a country that's already shown its aggressiveness towards its neighbors and its desire to expand territorially. So that I mean, obviously, it kind of makes a lot of sense. It's self-evidence. But I'm going to share an article that you wrote. I'm going to put it in the chat. If folks had not come across it in Lawfare, which I thought was a really interesting article because in my mind, you took the small and gave it significance that the individual person might not really see. It's actually about your article for those who haven't had a chance to look at it is basically about two Wagner operatives operating inside of Poland who were charged with what would amount to kind of lesser charges taken individually, whether it was some sort of espionage or some sort of, sowing discontent or some sort of something like on that scale. But you make these kind of smaller charges. So I would call them small potatoes into an entire meal, if you will, in the way it's shaping the transatlantic alliance and its approach to Russian hybrid warfare. Can you explain that a little bit? Give us a little bit more about the argumentation there and why you think something so little is actually going to have a much larger impact on the way things go in Europe going forward.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a theory of the case, right? And I guess we're going to have to see time will do its work and things will play out and we'll see whether or not my theory of the case actually bears out. But maybe I'll contextualize a little bit, sort of like, how it is I kind of came on to following this case in Krakow,
Yeah.
Poland, because it actually does connect to my book, Putin Sledgehammer. So, the book actually ends in, timeline wise after Yevgeny Prigozhin, the titular head of the Wagner Group, is killed, in August of 2023. And it actually, covers almost a full year after the fact, after his death, sort of ending with kind of three important things that happen, that kind of legacy he leaves behind. And the first was that, the whole mutiny and the kind of the Kremlin response to it led to a real shakeup inside the Ministry of Defense. And there was a huge
Right.
purge of like top level generals that were either close to Prigozhin or perceived as being somehow enabling the Wagner Group, or empowering corruption or being involved in corruption. At least a dozen top level officers, generals in the Russian military were, either investigated or tried, or, moved from their position. And so there was this massive purge. And then, of
Hmm.
course, there was the changing of the guard between the former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, who's
Right.
he's kind of an old school guy. He actually wasn't a military guy. He was a kind of military guy, civilian pretending to be a military guy. And
Ah,
he
I've
was
heard of those.
right. Yeah, there's a lot of those. And he was the one who had this sort of epic clash with Prigozhin, of course. There was all that, you know,
Right,
social
right.
media sort of stuff going on. So he gets fired. Well, fired kind of like he kind of fails up. He gets like a higher position, but it's kind of a little bit more ceremonial.
Heard of that too, actually.
Yes, exactly. And he's replaced by Andrei Belousov, who is now, who had been for a long time an advisor to Putin. He's an economist by training. And Putin really relied on him for trying to kind of like take it, evaluate the power of Russian defense industrial base, like really like look at, whether or not Russia could pull off a long-term war, primarily with the United States, right, and NATO.
Hmm.
And any such war, of course, would automatically implicate, the manufacturing of ammunition, the repair of vehicles, the use of, satellite technologies. It's kind of like the whole ecosystem of a defense industrial base is implicated in that kind of war, and certainly we've seen that play in Ukraine.
Hmm.
So that's another kind of part of like where the story ends, and that's actually the pivot point for this research that I've been doing on sabotage operations. And some of you may have been seeing a little bit of this bubbling up in the headlines, that there have been over the last 2, 3 years, basically since the start of 2023, really, Europe has experienced an escalation in sabotage attacks that are fomented by presumably Russian, GRU agents or their proxies. And, nobody really has, I think, a very solid count. CSIS, Seth Jones recently just came out with a piece on this. And there was not even a total count. It was like, several dozen incidents had taken place. And this is arsons, this is assassination attempts on
Hmm.
CEOs, big defense companies. This is, attacking, railroad lines that go from Poland into Ukraine that are essential for restocking and resupplying Ukraine. And so this has been bubbling for a while. Amid all of this, um, it just so happens that Europe has also started to prosecute Wagner Group fighters. Some, like the guy that I wrote about for Small Worlds Journal, wound up in Finland and kind of got caught in a trap there. Others are kind of being looked at in Norway. But this Polish case in Krakow kind of came across my news feed, basically.
Hmm.
And the story is, it's a long one. I'll try and make it as short as possible. Um, but it involves two guys, in their mid 30s. They're originally from Moscow. One's named uh, Alexei Titov, and the other is Andrei Gontarov. Kind of, like a Ren and Stimpy pair. Like one's like really kind of bulky, and the other's very skinny and small. Um, and they are fans of Moscow Spartak's football team. So it's, soccer. It's kind of like the, Chelsea or like, DC United of Moscow. They call it actually the People's Team. And in Russia, as in many places in Europe, there's a pretty strong hooligan culture, like football hooligan culture. Uh,
Hmm.
but in Russia, it also tends to mix with both the security services and the mafia. So these guys
Huh.
kind of join the Moscow Spartak fan club. They're kind of already involved in it. Um, they also happen to be connected to somebody who was very important to financing Russian proxy warfare, a guy named Konstantin Malafeyev, also known as the Orthodox oligarch. So he's a Russian guy who really believes in kind of
Mm.
survival of the Russian Empire. And their interests are fused by a few things, but most importantly, these two guys, um, kind of embrace the Wagner brand. And they're hired by a handler who's like one of these football fan guys to travel to Europe on three separate trips. One in June of 2023, so just before the mutiny, they fly to
Mm.
Spain and then on to France. And their assignment is to put up these kind of like leaflets. It's kind of like actually with this, sorry, I'm going to do it. I'm going to flash it, but like with this
Yeah.
logo, right, which is like the Wagner
The
logo,
Wagner. Yeah.
and it's got a QR code on it on the bottom. It's like, join Wagner or whatever. So they go to France and they plaster these all over the place, and they get paid $5,000 or thereabouts. And their handler's like, good job. And then they go to, and they're like, okay, but I have another assignment for you. So and then in early July, they go to Germany, sort of via a very circuitous route, and they do kind of the same thing, right? Put up all these stickers. And finally, in August, so now already like the mutiny has happened, the Wagner Group organization is kind of, in theory, like doesn't really exist anymore. But they're still going out to Poland. First, they go to Warsaw and they put up these stickers saying "Join Wagner," and it leads to the QR code. By the way, leads to a website that's a recruitment website for the Wagner Group. You can join like this 106 battalions associated with it. All very strange. But they get caught on CCTV in Poland doing this. Probably people were already kind of scrutinizing their movements, probably even earlier than that, but we don't know for certain.
Hmm. Hmm.
They get arrested, and this is like in August, I think 11th, 12th, 2023. So now it's only a few days before Prigozhin is about to die, right? Like in this terrible plane crash. So
Yeah.
this is a great story. I mean, here you think that this Wagner Group hybrid warfare venture is done, but actually it's just evolving, right? You have the Africa Corps, everybody seems to know about that,
Right. Yeah.
right? But nobody's paying attention to the fact that now Wagner is transforming into a brand that can be used to entice people to to execute sabotage operations in Europe. And it
Right.
happened that they are not the only ones. And oh, by the way, the other part of their assignment was put these stickers up, these flyers, and then take a picture of yourself or, a picture of the flyer, near the Eiffel Tower, like something iconic, to prove that you've actually done it, and then upload it to this popular Wagner Telegram channel. Okay. So it's got all of the elements of what we call hybrid warfare. It's got propaganda, right? It's got recruitment. It's
Right.
got, using civilian guys, right? To sort of travel around and do things deep behind enemy lines, right?
Right.
And it has the effect of mobilizing, you know, the population in theory, you know, to do something either for or against, right, Russia's interests.
Yeah, let me pause you real quick because I want to catch up because timing wise, at this point in time, Wagner has actually become, I mean, is this after the realignment, if you will, of kind of the Russian, control of Wagner, where they're doing much more directly Russian leadership biddings as opposed to, the just strictly doing whatever they're contracted to do by Prigozhin or on their own?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the irony. Like, it's like, yes, simultaneous to Prigozhin, you know, doing his crazy
Yeah,
Mutants March, and then the MOD formally seizing control, and then him being exiled.
yeah,
All of that stuff, and then taking over and like forming Africa Corps is happening simultaneous to these much quieter sabotage operations
efforts.
that
Yeah.
are Wagner branded.
And we assume so your assumption, I'm thinking, is that is in fact still basically Kremlin directed stuff now at this point. It's not just something that's being done. I mean, because what I'm trying to do is trying to connect this to actually directly to hybrid warfare, right? Because it becomes hybrid warfare when it's directed from the Kremlin, not when it's directed from some private military contractor doing what he wants to do.
Well, that certainly was my assumption going to the trial. Like it just so happened that I was actually in the neighborhood because I'd just done a trip to Ukraine, and I was coming back across the border exactly at the same time as one of the hearings, the opening hearings in this Krakow trial was happening.
Hmm.
So my assumption was if it's got Wagner like somehow, you know, as a brand,
Yeah,
somebody is back there, you know, with some puppet strings pulling.
right.
But I didn't really understand until I got into the courtroom, like the extent of the direction that was coming likely from the GRU and the extent of like the interconnections between key financiers who've been really central to the Kremlin's use of proxy warfare, particularly in the Ukraine case. You know, Malafeyev is one of them, right? He is somebody who also financed the operations of a guy named Igor Girkin,
Mm.
whose name is not as well known today. People, I think, forget about who he is. But if you remember the MH17 case where this Malaysia commercial jet
Yeah.
was downed in July of 2014, Gherkin, was largely considered to be responsible for that tragic accident that killed 290
Oh,
people. Now, he was also financed by Konstantin Malafeyev, and all of his forces, you know, these separatist
mm.
Russian forces in the Donbass, were largely, to a great extent, financed by Malafeyev. And so when I got into the courtroom, I was just expecting to hear something about, you know, stickers and you know, I didn't really know. I mean,
Right.
honestly, I was surprised at every minute. My eyes were just bulging because it was like, I can't believe this is happening.
Yeah.
It was really just an incredible story that was unfolding.
Well, that makes a lot more sense as to how you turn these small potatoes into something that actually you think kind of will reshape the power structures or at least the approach to hybrid warfare in amongst our NATO allies. So that flies with me. I get that. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What about these decisions? What about the actual trial and convictions and sentencing? Which again, 5.5 years, I think was the I mean, that's small potatoes. How
Hmm.
is it that this actually reshapes NATO's approach to hybrid warfare?
Yeah. Well, you know what's really interesting is that if you think about how Russia's irregular warfare campaign and sort of doctrine has evolved since 2014, right? Since the invasion of Crimea.
Hmm.
Um, what you see now is kind of like a little bit more like polished and almost strangely like more contained methodologies and tactics being employed. So even predating the Crimean invasion in 2014, we had the example of Estonia, right? Where, you know, a pretty like visceral, emotional, cultural war breaks out over a statue, right, in Estonia that this is 2012 that you know has a lot of controversy because it evokes some controversial history about how the Soviet Union treated Estonia, right? And in that instance, you had almost exactly the same methodology where you had Russian guys who were, coming into Estonia, which is just across the border from St. Petersburg,
Hmm.
uh, pretending to be like really upset to be part of like the Russian population,
Right.
defending Russian honor. And actually, they were just sort of like imported thugs, right? Under no
Hooligans probably too, right? Because that's that reputation. Or they probably, I mean,
Right. I
I'm
mean, I think
just,
it's probably it's a little bit of both, right? Like
yeah.
we don't know. There's still a lot of things we don't know about that. But what we do know is that the method was the same. It was like take this culture war moment, right? Like this culture war flashpoint, which was the statue, and turn it into a propaganda kind of performance, right? And
Okay.
and try and really build animosity, in the Russian population for the pro-transatlantic, pro-NATO government of Estonia. So that's
Hmm.
2012. It was pretty sloppy, right? It was so sloppy that the Estonians were like, this is really dumb, and they documented it very meticulously, right? And it's become the first example of what people point to as hybrid warfare, because it also involved social media and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Flash forward to 2014, same deal. You had, civilians who of strange provenance suddenly appearing like about a year before uh,
Hmm.
Crimea
Right.
invasion, right? Like the same thing, right? But no real branding. I think what's interesting about this case and others connected to it, by the way, there are dozens connected to this particular network inside Poland,
Hmm.
is that it really reflects a maturing of Russia's sort of use of irregular warfare, and the European response to it is also maturing, right? Finally, initially, it was kind of like we're going to document the bad things. Like, what does that do?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But in this instance, the Poles in particular have been very forward-leaning, and so have the Lithuanians, the Baltic states. And they've been very proactive with sharing intelligence with each other. And instead
Hmm.
of treating this as terrorism, they're treating it as organized crime, which I think is one thing, that makes it super powerful. Because essentially, you're kind of closing off these network nodes one by one. Now, is that the best and only response? Of course not. It's not going to be sufficient. But it's good to signal to Russia that there will be a price to pay.
Yeah.
And it's also good to continually expose the risk that Russia is willing to take, that sometimes actually could be quite serious. Here's an example, and I'll end with that.
Hmm.
You might have seen about a month ago, there were some headlines in the news about DHL cargo planes that where intelligence officers in Poland detected incendiary devices that had been planted on DHL cargo planes that were bound
Hmm.
for Canada and the United States. Now, luckily they were able to disable the devices, and they determined very quickly, of course, that this was Russian instigation. Um, but imagine if those planes had blown up. Imagine if, in the process of, trying to kind of put a scare into NATO partners, Russia not only blew up, a commercial,
Yeah.
jet, but
Hmm.
potentially even maybe disrupted air traffic, right, as a result of
Right.
it.
All right. Sure.
That is not even below the threshold of war. That is
Yeah. Yeah.
war.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
something. So this is the
Much
challenge,
easier. Yeah.
right? Part of what makes these small little cases so important is cutting off those network nodes and that connectivity between the network, does a lot to kind of de-escalate the risk of real war, real
Hmm. Sure.
contact.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's a big piece of it.
That's interesting. One of the things you mentioned in the article as well is this idea that um, this trial kind of highlighted the hybrid war component of this, that these were not isolated incidences that should be tried as espionage, tried as hooliganism or whatever, tried as something else smaller, but should be thought of as a whole. And so that was a big piece of it, right? Is that all these things come together to draw a picture of the hybrid warfare that is being directed by Moscow. But you said that basically a lot in the West, especially those not on the front lines per se, although they could have been had that DHL aircraft gotten blown up. The West is generally hesitant to do the sorts of things that Poland did in court there because of some fear of basically shutting down free speech because they have free speech cultural norms whatever that basically prevent them from charging these sorts of things as something that falls under hybrid warfare. And there's a pretty strong argument for that, I would think. But so are there mechanisms you think that would allow the Western countries from sliding down what you call that slippery slope of expanding the definitions of war, yet keep pace with the need to combat hybrid warfare tactics in the situation? And what brings this to my mind was the current administration's attempt to use the Alien Enemies Act to deport those they thought were threats to national security in absence of, well, in most cases, in absence of what we'd consider due process. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah. So there are kind of three kind of roads that you just kind of like highlighted there, or like avenues of travel. One is that
Hmm.
this kind of question of free speech, freedom of expression, and how hybrid warfare, and sort of Russian irregular warfare doctrine tends to exploit
Right,
that as part of its tactics. It's right. It's like to influence speech and ideas is one piece of irregular warfare is to try
yeah,
and
not the only ones doing that, but certainly
right. Oh, of course
they
not.
have,
Of course.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, all irregular warfare, whether it's Russian or Chinese or American,
yeah,
is predicated on the idea of kind of trying to mobilize the population to do something that is in the interest of you, right? And
right,
against the interest of your rival, right? So, and information is a big piece of that. In this case, was what was so fascinating was the arguments that you just made were the arguments that the defense attorneys made, right, for these two Russian guys, right? So you had a
right,
couple of Russian defense attorneys in there, or actually one Russian defense attorney, one Polish defense attorney. And both of them made the same argument. It was like, this is, yeah, if you really believe in free speech, they should be able to put stickers up and say whatever they want anytime, right? Why
yeah,
is that a threat, right?
right,
Is it because Poland's weak, or is it because, which again is another sort of rhetorical
sure,
sort of flourish,
framing,
right? Which
yep,
makes you kind of think maybe Poland is too weak. Maybe, maybe they should be clamping down on speech. And that's it. Now that would be, of course,
a
uh,
win for Russia.
that would be a win for Russia, right?
Yeah,
Suppressing information, suppressing sharing of information raises suspicion, right? Distrust for institutions,
right,
distrust for the government in power, right? Which makes it much more possible for a rival state to convince the population, yeah, that government or those
yeah,
Democrats or these liberals or that party over there, right?
yeah. These
That's
extremists, yeah,
these extremists are the ones that need to be suppressed, not us, right? Not the good guys, whoever that is.
yeah,
So there's that piece, and they were making that argument in the court. What was interesting was they had a forensic specialist there who had looked at their devices, so they had mobile phones and I think like iPads or something. And well, it doesn't matter really what they were saying in the in the leaflets and like what the rhetoric was on their email chats. They were kind of like getting ready to arm the brigade. So it was quite obvious that that they were
Wow.
planning something, and that they were
Don't
plotting.
look over here. Yeah,
Yeah. I
don't
mean,
look
another
over
piece was
here.
also that they had both trained at this kind of specialized, camp that is like bills itself as kind of like
Hmm.
hardcore paramilitary Eagle Scouts, but really is, sanctioned, and backed by the Russian state, right?
Hmm.
And so that was another piece of it. So like their whole defense fell apart because there was this other thing that you could point to, which was like the stuff that they were saying in their
Yeah,
email chats, the videos that they were making of them training like to kill people. It was quite obvious that they weren't just like playing around.
yeah,
So and I think that that is what made the prosecution so effective and powerful? And this is what they seem to be doing, the Poles and the Lithuanians, is kind of really getting in there and digging into the electronics, really looking beyond the rhetoric and the propaganda and piecing together. This is an organized crime group that is like mounting, basically reconnaissance operations for striking logistics lines all the way into Ukraine. So that's one piece, okay? So,
Hmm.
and now fast forward in your third line, your second line about sort of like, how do you go from that? How do you avoid the slippery slope of weird definitions, right? Like hybrid warfare could be anything.
Yeah. Right.
And I think, in the case of Poland, where, and I think some other states, the decision to focus on transnational organized crime as opposed to terrorism makes it a very bright line. Terrorism is about a political act directed presumably against the state and using civilian people, right,
Right.
and objects to make a point, right?
Yeah.
But organized crime is about conspiring to strangle the power of the state, right, or obstruct the power of the state. Very different argument. Now, on this question of the alien,
Enemies Act. Yeah.
yeah, Enemies Act, here's an interesting situation where um, the United States has such a weird patchwork of laws and traditions. On the one hand, the Trump administration has, categorized Trenda Arrega, which is this Venezuelan
Yeah.
gang, as a terrorist organization. Okay, like years after the fact, everybody's known that this organization exists, but suddenly now they're terrorists. Well, that's because again, that's a political path, right, to pursuing, you know, perceived enemies, be they civilians,
Right.
be they, extensions of a rival state. The terrorism category has always been useful, both for terrorists, right, but also for those who want to exact justice without sort of, looking at the foundational constitutional laws of a country, right, which would guarantee,
Right.
habeas corpus, which would guarantee, the right to due process, which would guarantee your ability to have free expression, right, and not be punished for it, right, as a result of your immigration status. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the parallels are really interesting, and I don't think it's at all surprising that, you know, a government that kind of seems more sympathetic to very authoritarian views, um, you know, reaches for the tool of categorizing, rivals and enemies as terrorists.
That's an interesting piece, especially when you talk about when we talk about free speech. That's an interesting piece. The difference between I had not thought of it, and it's really interesting. I'm going to kind of hit it again. Is this idea between terrorists and organized crime? Because organized crime can be it can be thought of as an apolitical issue. This doesn't matter who's in office or who you're targeting. If it's organized crime, it's organized crime, and it's going to basically affect any administration or any government that's in power. Whereas if it's terrorists, generally speaking, if you're labeling someone a terrorist, you're doing it at your convenience and probably based upon your own philosophical political ideas, as opposed to necessarily some sort of more generic criminal activity. There was a time when we discussed the global war on terror as being reducing terrorist networks to basically the handling of crime,
Mhm.
to criminal offenses, right? Reducing the threshold, the kind of the overall feeling of the threat posed. So I like that. I like that. I like the kind of it depoliticizes a little bit the idea of eliminating at least in some way constricting free speech, but at the same time gives you kind of a bipartisan approach to it as opposed to a much more political or rhetorical approach. That's I think it's excellent. We got a question in the question and answer block finally, which is great. Folks, I encourage you to drop a note in here because Candace is full of all sorts of really interesting ideas. Good, here comes some more. So the question is, there are numerous articles that say that since Trump's admiration for Putin, many of our European allies are now reluctant to share intelligence with the Trump administration. Are you hearing the same thing?
Yes, I am hearing the same thing. I think that there's a lot of anxiety within the transatlantic community, within the alliance amongst Europeans, about, sharing sensitive information that might be misused by the Trump administration or inadvertently leaked, because that's another issue that you now have because of the Signalgate. There's a lack of trust there.
Yeah.
And, it's so easy right now in this moment to be overwhelmed by the headlines and kind of forget that it was only just a year ago that there was still a criminal investigation open into, Trump's holding of sensitive classified materials in his home in Mar-a-Lago. Uh,
Hmm.
we weirdly, like, now that the prosecution has been ended, or
Drop the case. Yeah.
it's a very strange situation. Nobody has made any reference to, like, where are those boxes of information?
They
You
went
know,
back from what I understand.
yeah. Well, I'm not convinced that that's true. Actually, I'm not convinced that we got all of them back
Yeah.
into the
No, they
archive.
went back to Mar-a-Lago now that he's president again. I think that the original boxes have been taken back by the government.
Well, that's
Anyway, that's
interesting. I mean, so again, like, it's one of these strange situations where that's exactly, it's like right in the vector of information sharing and intelligence sharing, right? Because some of
yeah.
that information, as an example, we know, of course, had to do with Israel's plan for potentially bombing Iran. We also know that it had to do with kind of Saudi Arabia and relations with Israel and kind of
Right.
trying to broker something there. We also know that there was Russia files. We don't know what was in the Russia files, but we presume, I think there was some allusion to U.S. Nuclear power, and nuclear missiles and STRATCOM.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of, so I guess this is what I'm trying to say is, yes, European allies are nervous. Yes, there's a lot of anxiety. Yes, much of that is sort of prompted by the rhetoric of this current Trump administration. But it's also like a long history now, almost a decade, of a situation where you have a president of the United States who seems to be, at minimum, he seems to hold the same worldviews as Vladimir Putin. And I think
Hmm.
that is, if they're not always, sort of in lockstep, or if he is or isn't an asset, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that he seems to share a very similar worldview as Vladimir Putin does in terms of sort of the division of power between great power nations and the ways in which government and particular executives, right, within the government, presidents, kings, whatever, should exert power over their people, right? They
Right.
seem to share the same
Yeah.
worldview, and I think
Yeah.
that does make Europeans very nervous.
Yeah. Is it impacting? I mean, I'm making them nervous and actually cooperating or sharing are two different things. Do we know? I mean, I know you're not, I don't suspect you have a security clearance. You're probably not in these in some sort of
I bet I wouldn't
in
tell you, Jeff.
and you're not in some sort of center where you're collecting insurance or have seen it dispersed, but do you get the sense, are you getting any sense at all from officials in countries in Europe that they have restricted their cooperation in any way with the United States based upon their reluctance to share information?
I didn't hear anything, that suggested there was a concrete, concerted, cohesive effort to
Yeah.
restrict information. Perhaps there is, but it could be that the anxiety, which was very clearly expressed, okay, in every conversation that I had
Yeah.
with, Ministry of Defense and, et cetera, all these different places, even on the sidelines with other think tank people who are kind of in that world. It was definitely very obvious that the anxiety could, if it hasn't already, materialize as a review of intelligence policy and intelligence sharing policy. I would be shocked if that isn't happening right now, that there isn't some sort of debate happening, if not in the executive branch, certainly like in the security committees
Yeah.
of the parliamentary branches.
Right. Right. All right, I'm going to paraphrase one of the questions in the question and answer block, because I think it's about the information space, right? I mean, this is one of my personal concerns, quite frankly, with the security of the world we live in today. Is the information space is so, I use the word polluted, but it's so open as to create this, a lack of appreciation for what truth is anymore. It just seems so and I don't want to say we're in a post-truth world, but there's a lot more out there than it used to be, and not all of it rings true. And And yet you're mentioning how our tactics in a lot of spaces are evolving over time. Right? The Russians obviously have evolved their tactics in hybrid warfare. We have to be evolving our tactics as well. Do you see any evolutions? Because I know you're an OSINT expert. Do you see evolutions in the information space that give us a leg up or a further step ahead in basically shutting down our vulnerabilities in that area? It's a tough
Absolutely.
question because I think this is a really, really tricky answer, right? Especially for a Western democracy.
Yeah, listen. So, I mean, I think that the blossoming of open source intelligence as a movement, as a
Hmm.
social movement, as opposed
Yeah.
to like, a construct of international security, specialists,
Yeah.
has been just like revolutionary on so many levels. It's basically democratized the act of, verification, and which is of course kind of the core of any conflict resolution, right? And
Hmm.
conflict
Right.
management is verification of what the rival is doing, right? Like what's the
Yeah.
enemy doing? He says, let's say, let's talk about Iran. Like Iran says that they're not enriching uranium to weapons grade, but how do we know that? How do we verify that,
Right.
right?
All right.
Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, right? Verification is like, sometimes I think it's one of the most underrated parts of understanding the nature of conflict management.
Hmm.
And when you democratize verification processes, um,
Hmm.
you really you suck a lot of power out of irregular warfare. And
Hmm.
like, the more you have people, not just governments, right? As the force multiplier for countering
Right.
and exposing when a rival who says he's doing one thing is doing another, the more you're going to have cohesion, right, amongst the population of this is the nature of the truth. This is the thing that unifies us. And
Hmm.
all warfare is really about sort of unity of purpose as much as anything else, right? A common belief that
Yeah.
it's worth shedding blood,
Right.
to defend either a principle or a territory, both, right? And you can't have that if you don't have a common sense of what's the problem, what is the rival doing actually. And I think what
Yeah.
open source intelligence does is really like act as this huge force multiplier. And I think it's been very important, especially in the last year or two, I'd say, basically since the start of the invasion of Ukraine. It's been critical to understanding like what's going right and what's going on wrong on the battlefield. No
Right.
way, no way would Ukraine have the kind of sort of popular support it does still in Europe if there hadn't been so much work to expose all the different atrocities, all the different kind of
Yeah.
failures of Russia's conventional forces.
it, from sources that we're had used open source intelligence to verify that is really what's going on, right? It wasn't just
Right.
one voice out there, which is because we all have opinions, and we all have ways to voice those opinions. It becomes very loud and a cacophony of truths out there. But when you have somebody out there using open source intelligence to aggregate all that and find out that there is something that was as close to verifiable truth as can exist in the information space today. I think that's a really interesting and powerful tool, and I'm hopeful, I guess, that actually matures as well over the coming years. Another question from the audience that implies a little more maybe personal knowledge, hopefully not classified. It says a little off topic, but what do you make of the U.S. discontinuing offensive cyber operations against Russia?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so dangerous.
Yeah,
Obviously, because it's pretty obvious that Russia isn't done with its adversarial posture with the
right,
United States. Like,
right.
the nuclear weapons pointed at the United States, to my knowledge, as far as I know, okay, have not been moved and then pointed in another direction, right? As far as we know, Russia is putting a lot of energy into sabotage operations. As far as we know, Russia continues to probe the edges of the European territorial shield, where NATO begins and Ukraine
Yeah.
ends, basically. Okay.
Yep.
As far as I know, all of the things about Russia's adversarial relationship with the United States are still in play. And it is in cyber warfare where we have seen Russia be the most active because of
Hmm.
its asymmetric disadvantage, right, vis-a-vis NATO and the United States and power.
Hmm.
So, of course, standing down is not the best move. Now, there is a choice, I think, in signaling vis-a-vis offensive cyber operations, right? Which was, of course,
Yeah.
2018, U.S. Cyber Command took the decision to very publicly announce that the United States was going to be on the offensive with Russia, on the offensive with China, and immediately took action, right, and started to talk about it. Um, this is a situation where now we have announced to the enemy, come for us. We are open, the door is open. Don't even bother bringing weapons. You can just ransack our living room and our refrigerator. Go for it. I think it's super dangerous, right? And I actually think the signaling hasn't shown much in terms of results, in terms of Russia's
Right.
stance. So,
Right.
why take your most powerful tool, which is
Yeah.
the capacity to counter Russia, and then and then sort of denude yourself of that power?
Seems like a bad deal if
Bad
you're
deal.
talking deals. Yeah. Hey, so we got a couple minutes left, and I want to give you a chance to give the audience kind of a taste of your book. Explain to us what the book is, what the genesis of the story is, and a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. I mean, it is it's a life journey, basically, in some ways. I began writing the book. I really began thinking that, the Wagner Group would be pretty central to the story of Russia's incursion in Ukraine, certainly as early as probably December, January of, 2021, early 2022. So before the war, I was thinking, uh-oh, this is not looking good. And so the book really, kind of bloomed out of that sense of imminent fear on some level that this thing that was very obscure that I'd been studying for a few years, the Wagner Group, was suddenly going to end up taking center stage on the battlefield. So that was the impetus for writing the book.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a really lots of things are in the book. It covers, 30 plus years of Russian history. It's not, it's kind of like it's a book about Wagner, but it's also a book about how Putinism kind of came to be what it is today,
Right.
and the way in which militarism and ultranationalist kind of social movements in Russia began to fuse very closely with the mafia and fuse very closely with very disaffected veterans who, of course, after the Afghanistan war, were kind of left with not much to do.
Hmm.
And it's also a story about how the United States kind of got caught looking, just was really asleep at the wheel for most of those 30 years, not really
Yeah.
understanding that actually there was not a strong possibility of warm fuzzies.
Yeah.
It's told in a narrative style. It's not a big old thick book of analysis. I try and sort of make it into a little bit of a
Good
thriller.
story.
That's how it
Yeah.
unfolded.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That's exciting. I like the idea of it. I think because it adds, I mean, historians have utility in this situation for sure, because building the context around which we are trying to examine today's events is critical. And oftentimes we fail to do that because I think humans in general are just kind of ahistorical. They just, I mean, we don't take enough of that. How did we get here to understand where we are and where we might go? And I appreciate that. I look forward to reading it. We did get one more question in the Q&A block, and I think we've got time to answer it. That person asks, considering the Afrika Korps Wagner are less autonomous and more loyal to the Kremlin after the 2023 event, what potential impacts do these developments in Europe have on Russia's presence in Africa?
Hmm. So I think it's an interesting way to phrase the question, more loyal to the Kremlin.
Hmm.
I think maybe the another way to phrase that might be more dependent on the Kremlin
Hmm.
for all aspects of remuneration, so pay and benefits, in a way where in the Prigozhin era, there was still the possibility to freelance a little bit more. It's not to say that there isn't, but there does seem to be
Yeah.
a tighter leash. The implications are that, I mean, we already kind of seen with Africa Corps that the ambition of Africa Corps was to have something like 40,000 troops operating on the African continent. It's nowhere near that.
Mm.
They couldn't even really make 20,000 once they like lowered the threshold. We actually don't, I don't think we even know the number of actual boots on the ground, but I think it's safe to wager that it's less than 20,000. And we've seen some units be and detachments be pulled out of Burkina Faso, out of Niger, out of Mali, and
Mm.
sent to the front lines in Kursk, right? And
Oh,
so,
wow.
yeah, absolutely. So, and of course, people are getting injured, right? They're getting disaffected. This is a long war. The purpose is still the same, though. Like the whole setup of having auxiliary paramilitary forces that operate outside of the kind of constitutional command in the
Right.
traditional sense, um,
Right.
is to ensure that Russia has reach in a market that it would not otherwise be able to
Sure.
access. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's because and Russia really wouldn't have much need for that if it wasn't shut out of the global financial infrastructure. As long as that obtains, then
Yeah.
Russia will continue to try and find alternative markets for its
Right.
arms and for its energy, and try and create this kind of like counter NATO coalition that is predominantly in Africa.
Interesting. All right, we're coming up on our hour. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the thank you from our audience members. It's always enlightening. I love engaging you, Candace, in these sorts of events because it's just so informative. Your depth of knowledge is really tremendous. Your perspective is really unique, and we appreciate you making the time to share with us today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to reading your book. Good luck with the launch.
No, thank you. Pleasure being here. Thank you.
All right, take care.